people around Oppenheimer who built the bomb, they actually were saying that long term we should to use the bomb on the humans. Because if we don't do that, the world will not know what a terrible thing that would be, and it would, one way or another, sleepwalk into the nuclear war. Horrible thing to say. Hundreds of thousands of people killed in Japan. But the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is still with us, and I hope it will continue. So we are still, thank God, as human race, we are still very fearful of what our fathers, grandfathers witnessed in Japan back in the fall of 1945.
In 1989, Francis Fukuyama, a then very young American political scientist, declared that history was over. It had come to an end. He wrote a book with the same title just a couple of years later. The Cold War had finished, the USSR had collapsed, liberal democracy and market capitalism reigned supreme, and it wasn't going to change. And yet, in the last few years, the script has moved quite significantly. History, some say, has come back. Emblematic of that has been the conflict between Russia and Ukraine over the last 3 years, although, of course, you can date that all the way back to 2014. Today's guest is going to offer a deep history of Russia, Ukraine, that conflict, where it comes from and where it sits within the broader sweep of collapsing empires. He's also got a new book out about nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, the nuclear age. So we're going to talk about Russia, Ukraine, but also the possibility of proliferation. Is an increasingly multipolar world where history has indeed come back also a world where more and more countries have nuclear weapons? Serhii Plokhy, welcome to Downstream.
It's a pleasure.
Very happy to have you on. We're talking about your most recent book, The Nuclear Age, but also Russia, Ukraine. You've been one of the most seminal voices in that conflict. You yourself are from what is now Ukraine, but you were born in the USSR.
Yes.
Whereabouts are you from originally?
Well, originally I was born in Russia, but I spent in Russia maybe first couple weeks of my life, and my parents were really from Ukraine, so that's where I grew up. And it is southern Ukraine. It's Zaporizhia. Part of my one of ancestral villages is now under Russian occupation. Another is on the Ukrainian side, but completely destroyed. It was at the center of a counteroffensive back in 2023. Yes, I'm from the area where a lot of war is happening these days.
And you're also a very august historian at Harvard University. So you're looking at that conflict from two sides.
I look from close and afar, I would put it that way. And yeah, I was in September in Ukraine for a couple of weeks. I also visited my family in Zaporizhia, so close to the front lines. And yeah, from afar, certainly I'm trying to understand what is happening there as a historian, putting that into a broader historical context. And that's what I'm trying to do in my books.
So in your last book, not the most recent one, The Russo-Ukrainian War, which is really super useful, published in 2023, you refer to Russia as a dying empire. And of course, the USSR was an empire that died. What do you mean by Russia being a dying empire? And how does that fit with its motivations for the invasion of Ukraine?
Declining and disintegrating empire. So you look at the map, you probably can't miss Russia. This is the largest country in the world. And the basics are that nations don't get in control of that sort of territory. Empires acquire that sort of territory. So the British Empire was the largest in the world, the Russian is the next one, and Russia still holds those territories. The disintegration of the British Empire probably started with the American Revolution in the 18th century and then went all the way into the post-World War II era. The disintegration of the Russian Empire started with World War I, 1917. Then we see Bolsheviks bring back the former imperial territories. They fall apart in 1991 again. And now we see one of the probably bloodiest stories in the disintegration of what used to be Russian Empire and then used to be the Soviet Union. So that's where I was talking about trying to look at my own family, at the place where I'm coming from, through the lens of a historian, framing it in the historical context. That's what I see. That's where I arrive. This is the largest war in Europe since 1945, which is a big thing, unique if you look at this previous few decades and generations. But on the other hand, it's a very familiar story. The empires don't go down without a fight, and that's what we're witnessing today.
I think people would listen to that and say, well, I get the USSR being an empire. It's a continuation of the Russian Empire. You have more than 200 million people, multiple religions, languages, cultures, ethnicities, etc. But Russia's a bit different. Obviously, it's not homogenous, but it's a kind of nation state. So what do you mean by Russia being an empire? Do you mean that we're looking at the country balkanizing in the next couple of years? Are you talking more in a sort of economic sense, that it's about Moscow sucking in resources and people? What do you mean?
First of all, you are absolutely right that in the Russian Federation of today, that's the official name of the state, the Russians constitute majority, absolute majority. They didn't constitute absolute majority in the Soviet Union. But they're also waging the war not on the territory of the Russian Federation. They're waging the war on the territory of the former Russian Empire and former Soviet Union. So that's what the metropolis do, from Britain to France to Portugal to Spain. They're waging the wars outside of the metropolis. So that's what Russia does. But there is also one particularity about Russian situation that probably you wouldn't find, let's say, in Britain. Whatever were the relations and are between Britain and India, no one in UK believed that the origins of England or United Kingdom are in Delhi. But that's what many Russians believe, that the origins of Russia are in the city of Kiev, that happens to be the capital of Ukraine. And the Russian policies in this war is to annihilate Ukrainians as a separate identity. Putin is talking and writing about Ukrainians and Russians being one and the same nation, which means that Ukrainians don't exist. They're really Russians. And that's what puts this particular war and the Russian war in Ukraine aside from what we saw with French wars, colonial wars, or British colonial wars, or Italian or Spanish or Portuguese.
I suppose a Russian ultranationalist, and it's funny, you have to ventriloquize all kinds of people and arguments, but I never thought I would say, as a Russian ultranationalist might say,
okay,
Kievan Rus is historically a foundational part of what is now the modern Russian polity, and it is in a separate country. Is that unique? Or because I can think of other places like Iran, for instance, Shah Abbas the Great, who starts a very important dynasty there. He's born in Herat or in Afghanistan, or many of their famous poets who were Persian-speaking are from modern-day Uzbekistan or Azerbaijan, and so it's a transnational sort of cultural sphere in a sense. Is that how Putin sees Ukraine, or is it something quite different?
Yeah, I think I can explain how Putin sees Ukraine. You can look, again, I came from the United States, I'm going back there in a few days, and certainly the political origins of culture, fascination with Shakespeare and other things, they start here in London, they start in UK. That was the center of the empire that then created the colonies in North America, and then colonies turned into independent state as the result of the war for independence. What Putin is doing now would be historically on par with Trump claiming now not Canada but UK, Britain, because that's where the origins of the political system, the language, the ideas, the literature that many Americans consider to be their own was born. So that's a case of a state that grew on the periphery of the empire, became more powerful than what used to be the metropoly, and now making claim for former metropoly. Again, in American and British case, that's a relatively recent history. Relatively recent, I mean, 200 or 300 years. In the Russian-Ukrainian case, that's less recent history, where we're talking about 700, 800, 900 years before. But that's the story. Periphery grow, and then they acquire identity of their own, or don't acquire identity of their own, and then try to reshape and redraw the map of the world.
Why does Russia think in these ways? And again, that's not necessarily to criticize Vladimir Putin or to take a side. I have a side. One side's starting a legal war of aggression. But again, it seems quite objectively true that Russia, which is a country of 145 million people, views itself as a civilizational state. When you're India with 1.3 billion or in China 1.3 billion, you kind of get it, right? It makes sense. But Russia's population is significantly smaller than the United States or Pakistan, and yet it thinks in these very expansive civilizational terms. Where does that come from? Is that just like a historical accident because of the demise of the Soviet Union, or is it actually something deeper in the Russian political culture?
I would say it is deeper, and I would really explain that first and foremost through religion. And Russia is a Christian nation. Again, it wasn't always Christian like most of the nations, but today it is Christian. And not just any Christian, but Orthodox. And it perceived itself from very early on as a continuator of the Byzantine Empire. That's where the Eastern Christianity came from. First to Kiev, and then was transported from the center of the Kievan Empire, called Kievan Rus, to the periphery, which happened to be Russia and was inherited by Russia. So there is this thinking, first of all, religious, a legacy of the Byzantine Empire in terms of religion. And the second impulse for thinking about Russia as a civilizational entity is, of course, control over the territory. Territory is very much inherited from the empire of which Russian territories used to be a part of. That's the Mongol Empire. So Russian territories used to be the empire run from Kiev during the medieval period, and then they were part of Mongol Empire, and they very much in the 16th century took over the control of most of that empire. So the territory, you look at the map, we talked about the map, they give you an idea of this basically grandeur that probably others don't have. So I would put emphasis on religion and religious tradition linked to Byzantium, and to the territory linked to the Mongol Empire. But as you said, it's 140, 150 million. It's not up there in terms of China or India, for that matter. They're not up there in terms, if you look at the United Europe, very much shaped by Western Christianity, by Roman Christianity, even if it's Protestantism. And you see that population-wise, the Russians are not there. Also, in terms of the creation of a particular and specific culture, they're not there. It's not as distinct as what is created in China. It's not as distinct as what is happening in India, despite the fact that India is, of course, not united. It's a conglomerate of different traditions and cultures. But Russian is a combination of whatever was there authentic before 18th century, and then strong Western influences, mostly on the elite. So the Russian culture in many ways is a hybrid between Western culture and Eastern, which also, or some Eastern influences at least, and that's also creates probably problems and anxiety as a result of that. So you have these ambitions based on your historical roots, based on territory to be a civilization, but then there are major handicaps that you have to deal with in one way or another, and unfortunately, Russia deals with this insecurities through aggression.
I don't know about you, but recently I'm on Instagram, I'm scrolling through my feed, and all I see are adverts and generative AI and stuff I never wanted to see in the first place. It's not remotely like the experience I had on Instagram years ago, where I was following people I chose to follow, or people at least that were vaguely similar to the people that I chose to follow. We're in a very different world now. My timeline has changed, and I suspect yours has as well. And of course, it's not just Instagram. Well, guess what? Cory Doctorow, one of my favorite sci-fi writers, big brain, smart guy, the person behind boingboing.net all those years ago, has written a new book called Enshittification. Pardon the title, I hope no children are watching. And that is looking at, chronicling what big tech has done to the internet and to our feeds at a very fundamental level. I can't wait for this event. The internet and digital culture is always something very close to my heart. Cory is an amazing speaker and thinker. Come and join us, because we're doing an event offline, important to say. That's on November the 17th at Earth Theatre in Hackney. Doors open at 6:30. The event gets going, I believe, at 7:30. If you want to join us for that great event, see Cory, maybe get the book, have a chat afterwards. The link is in the description below. November the 17th at Earth Theatre in Hackney with Cory Doctorow and me and some special guests who are on the way. I'd love you to join us. When does this idea of bigness become core to the Russian political imaginary? Because obviously it wasn't always that big. Like you say, a lot of this land was part of the sort of the Mongol sphere, the Golden Horde, and various khanates and so on. And, you know, people know about Russian expansionism into Europe over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, but south as well, taking on the Qajars in Iran, issues with the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean around the First World War. So we're talking over a period of centuries, this lust for just constant expansion, which of course many states over history have had, but Russia seems peculiarly enamored with it, and it doesn't often seem to serve a political purpose. So where does that come from? What sort of historical epoch?
Again, we are talking about empires, and in that sense, Russia is not unique in this expansion. Expansion, you look to improve your geopolitical position. You're looking for access to natural resources. You're looking to the access to people. You're trying also to get, in Russia's case, you don't get that in European cases. You try to get parts of Central Europe also to get elements, particular elements of culture, including political culture, that you think they can help you. So all of that is not unique. What is unique about Russia is geography. Most of European empires, they got their colonies outside of Europe per se, so it's overseas. And for Russia, it's it's a land-based empire, and with land-based empire come opportunities, but also come challenges. So where do you stop? Where do you stop? And every new frontier that you got, for whatever reasons, for reasons of security, for reasons of acquiring better political standing, getting access to resources, the next 100 kilometers present a set of opportunities and a set of challenges. So I look at whatever is unique about the Russian Empire mostly through the prism of really a very specific geographic position, and that's the position in Eurasia, rather than in Europe, where to build an empire you have to go overseas.
So to understand all of this, basically, it's a culmination of accident geography, religion, and you're inheriting certain sort of contiguous territories from the Mongols, and one passes to the other. You say it's a dying empire and that the USSR is a dead empire. But I wonder, in the context of geopolitics in 2025, the counter-argument is that the United States is a dying empire. The European Union, or Europe per se, is certainly seems to be dying in some aspects. And somebody who comes at this with a different angle, I mean, in your book, you talk about a probable return to bipolarity. They talk about multipolarity. They would say, yeah, Russia's getting weaker. Its demographics are terrible. The same is true for Europe. The same is true of the United States. And ultimately, that's a function of power moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What do you make of that? Is that just kind of pro-Kremlin cope?
It can be, but I think it's also a legitimate question. My answer to the legitimate question versus just a propaganda sort of statement is that if you look at Europe and Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, after 1991, what you see is Europe expanding because there is a lineup of countries standing, knocking on the doors, asking to be admitted to the European Union, asking to be admitted under the umbrella of NATO. We now don't know whether the umbrella is still there or not, how many holes are in that umbrella. But there is a lineup. When you look at the Russia building up its Eurasian Union, it has to engage in the wars and arm twisting to get countries like Ukraine to join in, and they refuse. So that, for me, is just one indicator that there is a lot of exciting politically, culturally, economically things happening in what is Europe and what is Russia. And again, I'm now in UK watching news about people trying to get to the UK, right? That's we don't see that happening in Russia per se. So that's more kind of a comment supporting the proposition that I made. But then, as a historian, I also see a huge difference between Europe and European Union and, let's say, the Habsburg Empire that was there before. So you have here a union with a lot of power still within the capitals, and you see capitals of individual countries. They voluntarily joined, they could leave, they tried to advocate their rights, and that's not your classic imperial experience. That's not how empires work and function. Empires, there is plenty of definitions of them, but one of the definitions is the ability to project power at a distance, and that's certainly the classic imperial case in European Union. That power, you can point fingers at Brussels, but it's much more kind of a dispersed. There are different centers of power. And the United States, with the exception of Philippines, were never an empire. The post-imperial and post-colonial tendencies would be best probably represented in Central and Southern Africa. But I would put emphasis on U.S. really, first of all, getting into existence in revolt against traditional empire, and then finding the way to project their power and also to gain or to protect is the wrong term, but to advance their interests. That's the word that I was looking for. To advance their interests without traditional elements of empire and imperial dependency. So U.S. is pretty much one of the authors of the post-imperial and post-colonial world, and you can call near-colonial or near-imperial, but this is not traditional. Europe is not now anymore traditional empire. But Russia is still looking for the way, for the exit from this 18th, 19th century, to a degree 20th century imperial construct. It tried to do that at the beginning of the 2000s, when more liberal elements in Russia, like Anatoly Chubais, for example, the author of Russian Privatization, very controversial privatization, very controversial figure, but he was saying, okay, we have to build a liberal empire. That would be more or less American model, where we would advance our interests through politics, through soft power, through the presence of our financial institutions and corporations. And that was the model that they tried, and it didn't work because the Russian influences were stopped by things that were called in Russia, in particular, the color revolutions. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Revolution of Roses in Georgia. So people went to the streets and stopped that process, stopped their own governments from participating in what was defined as liberal empire. And with the project of liberal empire gone, what went was the military empire, was the use of force, from Georgia in 2008 to Crimea in 2014 to all-out aggression against Ukraine in 2022. So it's not like Russians didn't try to emulate, let's say, American example, but they failed, and failed mostly because of the people. Protesting, people showing on the streets. The elites were they either bribed elites or got them in some other way on their side. But it's the people who stopped that project.
Are you not simple? Well, you're obviously not. But do you not see some truth in the characterization of some of these color revolutions as, CIA-backed putches with Western-backed NGOs at their heart? And I know that's often overstated. There's some truth to it. I know some of the people involved in some of those NGOs, and they are quite close to the State Department or BP or whatever. And so there is obviously certainly smoke. The question is there fire? What do you make of that sort of the pushback, which is actually these color revolutions were about shrinking the Russian sphere of influence? And, I agree with you, countries should be sovereign, but that needs to be probably done in a more productive way than how it happened. How would you respond to that, for instance, with the color revolution in Georgia?
I think there is this perception of either CIA on the American side or the Federal Security Service in Russia, FSB, and intelligence as all-powerful actors. And it's not like they're not trying to do things, but they're not powerful enough to produce the wave of revolutions or to wave of protests that would continue and go on there. There has to be a basis for that. There has to be a reason, there has to be ideology, and then these outside players can come and maybe provide money or provide some other support. But my reading that in the social processes, in the social protests that are happening anywhere in the world, security services are not powerful enough to engineer them. They would play their game, they probably facilitate, and on the margins that would matter. But I've been on Maidan in 2004 in Ukraine. I've been on later than in 2013, and I know why my friends were there. I know that they were not paid, and that was the majority. So at some point, as a historian, I can say we hopefully will get to the archives. We can say how much this or that intelligence service played a role in either what is happening in Europe today or what was happening in Eastern Europe during the color revolutions. But as a historian, I can say that historically the military coups, that's the way where the security service can be really a key player. but not mass revolutions and protests. You can't just engineer that by throwing in a couple of $1 million here and there.
So they're authentic, almost always authentic expressions of civil society and real grievances.
I would say almost everywhere. Yeah, and then they're happening around the same time, and this is response to the same sort of challenges. So again, the intelligence services, they're working, they're trying to earn their pay, but they can ride only the wave that is already there.
You said about, I know what they wanted in Maidan. In terms of Georgia, I mean, that would be my question as somebody who lives in Europe. What do they want? Because there are people in Georgia that want to join the European Union. And of course, if you look at a map, Ukraine borders Poland. I mean, that's a comprehensible expansion. But Georgia, of course, it's a Christian country. But, there's bits of Georgia that are further east of bits of Iran. It's further east than Iraq. And I think lots of people would say, well, you might want to join the European Union, but you're definitely not in Europe. So what do they want? And what kind of sort of political outcome would they settle for short of joining the European Union? Because their neighborhood is one of a former Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Persian Empire. All three of those disappear. So what next?
Yeah, I would have to Google that. It seems to me technically they're in Europe. But you're absolutely right in terms of geography. The geography is not really favoring them joining European Union to a degree that geography, let's say, favored Hungary or Slovakia or today some of the Balkan countries. They're further away. I'm not an expert on Georgian politics, but let me try to use what I know about Ukrainian politics and extrapolate to Georgia, because both revolutions, the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, and then 2013, 2014, so-called Euro Revolution or Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, they were not about joining EU, and certainly they were not about joining NATO. The Euro Revolution was about signing association agreement with European Union. And what people in Ukraine wanted and hoped for, they wanted the European legislation, the European institutions somehow to come to their country to help them to deal with authoritarian regime that was becoming more and more authoritarian in Ukraine under President Yanukovych, and also help to deal with the corruption and introduce a more fair rules of engagement. So they knew that European Union didn't expect them. That was if the horizon of that, if ever happening, was horizon more for their children than for them. So they wanted Europe inside of their countries. That means that rule of law, that means democracy, that means less corruption. I'm talking about that really having first-hand knowledge about expectations of people in Ukraine, and I would extrapolate that to Georgia as well. But I'm not as sure about Georgia as about Ukraine. But that's probably would be my answer to your question. Very good and legitimate question about geography. So. It's about inviting Europe in rather than necessarily joining next year European Union. It doesn't mean that if they have an opportunity they wouldn't join, and if they're welcomed. But more realistically thinking, it's about European norms. And I remember people were asking me, "Are you crazy?" Speaking about this protests in Ukraine, don't you know? In what a bad shape European Union is, what the problems are there, and so on and so forth. And I was thinking about that, and I think that it's Europe at that point was less about realities and specifics as was about the particular model that people wanted to follow, or maybe I would say European ideals that people wanted to follow in their own country. So that's how I understood certainly 2013, and that's how I extrapolate in that on Georgia, understand also Georgian political struggles.
I mean, the thing is, if I was Georgian, I'd be with those guys. You want all of those things you're talking about: due process, rule of law. You want modernity. But at the same time, the European Union as a political entity, is it really going to be that robust if it stretches from Ireland to Georgia? These are the questions of empire, right? Overreach, because I know you're not saying that EU's an empire, but or a political bureaucracy. Overreach is always is a potential problem. And I suppose the question is, if a country like Georgia can't be in Europe or the European Union, what other means are there for it to modernise? And that's the problem for Georgians, right? Because the alternative seems to be either you're in Moscow's sphere of influence or you do join the European Union, and neither fit. But I know which one seems better.
No. I certainly hear you. And I can only say that the Euro revolution or revolution of dignity in Ukraine was not about joining EU. It was about association agreement with European Union, which is not only joining the some elements of the market, but also about some institutional the laws that are supposed to be more in line with European. So and these things can be created, the mechanisms that are somewhere in between. But again, the Ukrainians went to the streets and were staying there for weeks and months in sub-zero temperature for association agreement with European Union, which meant some elements of European legal system, political culture, democracy in particular, would be also present in Ukraine, and that being member of association agreement, the authorities would have to, at least on some level, follow those standards. That was thinking in 2013. So I would say that there are already mechanisms that are being created for being at least for partaking in part of the European experience, and even overcoming geography. And if there is certainly a strong wish on the part of a particular society, on the part of a particular country, and adequate response from European Union, other forums can be found as well. So I'm not prepared to present you something already ready to go, but looking at my own experience, at the experience of Ukraine, I know that there are some forms in between that already help those societies to fight back authoritarian regimes, and do that by introducing elements of the rule of law.
I hope you're enjoying this Downstream as much as I enjoyed making it. I love Downstream because we get to talk to some of the most interesting people about some of the most interesting ideas. Lots of people are black-pilled these days. Things are getting worse. There's no future. Don't be optimistic. But great people are doing fascinating work all of the time. And that's kind of the vibe we try to bring to you with this show. Not just on YouTube, but also our events. However, we're adding to the repertoire. We're doing a newsletter too. Click the link in the description below. It's not live yet. It's still in the pipes, but it's coming in the weeks ahead. That's at novara.media/downstream newsletter. Join our community of sunlit uplands and downstream optimism. I hope to see you there. So there's that book, Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. It's one of the very few works of political science which becomes part of the popular argot of conversations, and the term is very widespread now. And memorably in that book, it has, a map of the world, civilizationally, and there are lots of outliers, like Iran or Japan. They're not quite big enough, but they're kind of politically and culturally quite discrete. One of the most interesting aspects of that map, though, was that Ukraine was basically cut in two. And Samuel Huntington's kind of assertion was, and quite prophetically, was that in his view, Ukraine, west of the river Dnieper, was European civilization, and east was greater Russian civilization. Now, I'm not suggesting that's accurate, but to what extent do some people in Ukraine view themselves as being part of that Russian civilization, while others view themselves as being part of that European civilization? Did that capture a certain truth content about cultural differences within one country?
I have a book which is on Ukrainian history called The Gates of Europe, and I start one of the chapters by engaging with Huntington because technically he got it all wrong. The line that he was trying to draw was on the basis of religion between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And I write there that you go to that line, and what you see there, it's a lot of gray zones between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, because Ukrainians produced a hybrid church, which is Orthodox and Catholic at the same time, under the Pope of Rome, but with the Orthodox liturgy and calendar. So that clear line in Ukraine never existed. But that doesn't mean that there is no serious regionalism in Ukraine, associated with the fact that over a long period of time, different parts of Ukraine belong to different empires. Austria-Hungary, Russian Empire, the South for a long period of time was Ottoman. Crimea was Ottoman before it became Russian in the late 18th century. So those regional divisions are there. And Russia was able to really use that quite effectively in 2014. So the annexation of the Crimea, the start of the so-called hybrid warfare in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. Crimea, that is the only region of Ukraine where ethnic Russians were the majority and are the majority, and Russian speakers are, of course, the absolute majority in Donbass and in the east. So it was used very effectively with minimal military force. The war eventually started in 2014 and 2015, but really the annexation of the Crimea, the Ukrainians didn't understand what was going on. Now, fast forward to the start of this war, 2022, the all-out aggression. The Russians are coming under the same banner, defending the rights of Russian speakers, and get zero traction, including in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, in the south.
Zero traction.
And in the east, zero. You can look at the footage coming from the February and March of 2022 in Russian-speaking cities like Kherson, like Melitopol, that were taken over by Russian troops. The Russian-speaking population is marching under Ukrainian banners against the Russian tanks. So the card of the protection of the national minorities that was played by Hitler in 1938 in Czechoslovakia with Sudetenland, by Putin in the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine in 2014 didn't work in 2022, which really the only way to explain it is that, first of all, the Ukrainians of all ethnic backgrounds or linguistic groups realized after 2014 that they had something to lose by Russians coming in. And something to lose was the level of democracy and pluralism, political and otherwise, that Ukraine preserved after 1991 for a number of reasons. Russia, for a number of reasons, really lost the democratic momentum that was in the early 90s. The Belarus lost, most of the post-Soviet countries lost. Ukraine was one of a number that preserved that. And you see this level of unification of the sort that really in the textbooks you can read about political nation, but really encounter it in real life. All political nations at the end are based on some ethnic core. Here you see that, and you see the nation led by a Jewish president, a president of Jewish background. You see the Crimean Tatar being the Minister of Defense and now the head of the Security Council. You see the Ukrainian top military commander, General Syrskyi, being ethnic Russian from Russia. So you see a sort of the political nation mobilization that became immune to this play of the card about the language or about religion or about these divisions that exist in Ukraine. Again, it's not like divisions disappeared altogether, and certainly they probably still can be somehow weaponized in the future. But what I see looking at Ukraine in 2014, the start of the war, in 2022, the response to the all-out aggression, it's two quite different societies, and this existential threat of 2014 produced a sort of mobilization across religious and ethnic lines that didn't exist before.
And presumably Putin wasn't expecting that.
Yes, I think again that's my guess. I don't know. You can't get into Putin's head, but I think that he saw what was happening, and there was a realization that the time was passing where he can still control Ukraine. He rushed in 22 with more troops than he had back in 2014, significantly more. But still, he misjudged how advanced the whole process of this unification of Ukrainian nation got already by 2022, and got the response that, of course, he didn't expect. He didn't expect. You look at the pronouncements at that time, and he expects that the Ukrainian army would switch sides. He appeals twice to the Ukrainian military. He expects that the only resistance that would be there would be from the so-called nationalist battalions. Clearly, he felt that things were not moving in the right direction for him, but he didn't realize how far they got.
But why did he think that? Because, as a relatively uninformed person in the UK, when it started, I presumed Russia would win quite quickly, but then you would have some kind of guerrilla resistance, which, like you see in Iraq with the Americans, you very rarely can win. That's what I presumed. So I thought it was a bad move by Russia, but for very different reasons to how it turned out. So why did he think that a regular army would just side with him and there would be no guerrilla resistance? I mean, that's kind of unprecedented in modern history. So I wonder why he thinks that he's so exceptional.
Yes, I think that he was asking that sort of questions before the invasion. And in terms of the Ukrainian army switching, he had an experience of 2014, when Ukrainian army was ordered not to engage in the fight. First of all, it psychologically and otherwise was not ready. Second, that's what Kyiv was telling, let's not make things worse. That's what Western advisors were telling Kyiv as well, just don't create a big. So it wasn't completely out of a blue. And then also looking at history, I don't know whether that was his thinking, but let's say put ourselves in roughly in that position. What he knew was that there was really nationalist resistance to the Soviet power in Western Ukraine that was going all the way into the early 1950s. So can you imagine May 1945, the red banner is over Reichstag. And within the Soviet Union, the same Red Army fighting the Ukrainian resistance into early 1950s, 5, 6, 7 years after Reichstag. So in no pronouncements we see really Putin trying to get control of Western Ukraine. That's where the resistance was taking place. So it's the name of the whole thing is just to being a captive of history, and history is very useful and it can instruct you in many ways. But things change, and if you base this only on the historical trends and trajectory, and don't account for the changes that are happening, you are probably whatever you do will not end up in the place where you were going.
Who are the sort of major military thinkers over there? Because it does feel like Vladimir Putin, and again, like some people be watching this or listening to this going, oh my God, Aaron, you've been so misled by the Western psyop media, But it does genuinely feel like Vladimir Putin just read too many history books and that he's taken too much of a strategic lead on something which is a huge deal, like a major conventional war, like you said, the biggest in Europe since 1945. And it does feel that the strategic objectives of the conflict, even now, for somebody like yourself, I mean, they're not crystal clear, which I find kind of insane.
I would agree with reading a lot of history books, and I would add bad history. Because before the start of the all-out aggression in summer of 21, a huge historical essay was written, or at least signed, by Vladimir Putin. And the essence of what he is saying there is presented very clearly in the very first paragraph. He is open about that. He says that I have been saying again and again that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, and here is my historical argumentation for that. Well, the thesis itself comes from the Russian imperial history from the 19th century, from classics also of Russian historiography of that period. So he takes the model of the Russian nation of the imperial period of the 19th century and now tries to bring it into the 21st century, which is, of course, insane. But that's also about the harm that comes with reading outdated books. It sounds a little bit self-serving. I'm promoting my own books that are not as old and more recent, but that's exactly the situation that we have with Putin. And objectives were formulated maybe in a weird language, but they were stated very clearly. Again, the Ukrainians didn't exist, don't exist, should not exist.
What does that mean? What does that mean? I know what you mean. So he says de-Nazification, but what were they like? There's that great memo, I think it's sent from Eisenhower, isn't it? Our mission is complete because they've got the surrender of Japan kind of thing. So what was the mission?
The mission, again, I don't think that he was trying to mislead anybody by giving the name to that war and then sticking to it, which was called Special Military Operation. So the idea was that it would be a couple of weeks. The Kiev would fall. He would install the pro-Russian leader there, which would conduct the policies of Russification. And eventually there will be either Russian state or, of the type of Belarus, right, led by some sort of local dictator, which would introduce all these ideas about Russians and Ukrainians would be one and the same people. So that's it looks like, at least from my perspective, what was the idea. But the plan was for the first 2 weeks. Now we are in the 4th year of the war, and certainly the official pronouncements are that the causes of the war didn't change, the objectives didn't change. That means denazification really means de-Ukrainization, because otherwise you have an authoritarian country attacking democratic country, talking about Nazis led by the Jewish president. Come on, there have to be some limits to that craziness. And limits are, in a sense, that the denazification really is translated into normal language. The language that we would understand is de-Ukrainization. That is happening on the occupied territories of Ukraine. The history textbooks, including my own, all of that are being removed. They're not burned, but they're being thrown out of the libraries, of the educational institutions. I don't know what happens with them after that, but that's the only kind of reasonable way to interpret the whole thing about denazification, because otherwise it makes just no sense.
So he wanted the government in Kyiv to collapse, but how far does it go? Did he want Lviv? Did he want Western Ukraine to be part of that, or did he want it to be like just a rump state? Some people say that he just wanted a kind of a forever war, a grey forever war between that rump state and Russia to just sort of disintegrate its capacity. What do you think?
Well, I think that one thing that can be said about Putin, that he is quite skillful tactician. That means that the means, the goals can change depending on how things develop. But back in 2014, we know that there were feelers sent from Moscow to leaders of Hungary, to leaders of Poland, inviting them to partake in partitioning of Ukraine. He was saying, okay, I don't want Western Ukraine. I probably can't turn them into good Russians. You're welcome to come and take them. That's certainly what we know from the now Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radoslav Sikorski, but also from other European leaders. That was the story of 2014. I don't know whether the same was the plan for 22 or not. And today we are in a situation where the Russian drones attack Poland, and the airspace in Northern Europe is being violated by Russian jets. So my opinion is that all these goals are quite tactical. If he is not stopped, he will continue, because looking generationally, he and other people in the Russian government, they came into their adult life in the 1970s, where the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War, where the Soviet Union certainly controlled Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union was on par competing with the United States. So we all have kind of nostalgic view of our youth and the world that existed back then. So I think it's many of that is opportunistic. So and think that the playing the gas game of where Putin would stop out of his own volition, not very productive.
I find this idea about boomer nostalgia being really interesting. So, like you say, you're born in the Soviet Union, early 1950s, baby boom, maybe late 1940s. You kind of become that young person, like you said, at the apogee of Soviet Empire, right? Late 60s, early 70s. It's kind of a moment where people think, actually, these guys might win. And geopolitically, you're certainly not weak.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there is a case almost that, and I don't like to talk about this. There's that great Planck's principle. Scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time.
Okay.
Maybe a political transformation of the Russian culture become, a thing about one funeral at a time. But the demographics of all of this, both in elite politics, but also how Russia fights the war, are really fascinating to me. Also for Ukraine too. And I think it goes to the point about you saying that Putin's a tactician and he might, probe Europe's weaknesses. Again, to be devil's advocate, we're kind of confronted with Schrodinger's Putin, right? On the one hand, his inept army can't get out of Eastern Ukraine. They're stuck there for years. But on the other hand, we're told that he's, a potential threat to Lithuania, which I think is probably quite true. Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, the Nordics, etc. And I suppose there's that response, well, which is it? Is it this useless guy who can't fight his way out of, a country that's right next to him? Or is it somebody who actually is, the biggest threat to Europe since, Hitler and Napoleon? Because it quite clearly can't be both.
I think it is both. In what sense? The expectations in Europe and all over the world was that when the mighty Soviet-Russian army knocks on your door, the best strategy is actually to raise your hands. That's why the expectations were that Kyiv would fall in 3 days. That's why every Western embassy was withdrawn from Ukraine. And Ukraine is still fighting. And I don't think that anyone in Europe, maybe with the exception of the Baltic states, is prepared to really put that sort of a fight. At least historically, that didn't happen. The only exception was Finland in 1940 fighting back, but other than that, there was no resistance. And part of that was that most of those countries, in comparison to Ukraine, territorially and otherwise, especially when you talk about the Baltics, they're relatively small countries, right? So that they don't have this depth that they can, the front line could roll and go back. So the fact that he can get through the Ukrainian army doesn't mean that he can't get through European armies. I'll give you just one example. September 10th of this year, I was in Kyiv, so there was a little bit of the fire in the sky during the night. I was jet lagged, so I all that saw and listened. But most of the drones went toward Poland. 19 drones got to Poland. Some of them were shot down. Some of them with very expensive missiles by the planes, so on and so forth. So Poland, out of all countries, NATO, are not prepared to deal with that. And what European country can go through that sacrifice that Ukraine is going now? So just judging Europe by Ukraine and Ukrainian resistance probably would be oversimplification. And also looking at the Ukrainian territory and the depth that Ukrainians can retreat and still hold Kyiv and major centers, and looking at Estonia and looking at Latvia, looking at Lithuania, the geography. The geography is very different. So its inability to deal with Ukraine doesn't automatically translate in an ability to deal with the eastern flank of NATO, especially given that psychologically Europeans are not ready.
The Baltics, I totally get. And like I said, if I was Lithuanian, I'd be thinking, we're next. But, and I buy your point. So what people are overstating is Russian incompetence, ineptitude, when actually the real story is technical, tactical capabilities of the Ukrainian army, really. But this is a country of 145 million people. I think the median age is it's getting to 50. It's a very old country. They're using, in many cases, old technology, in some cases, very, very modern, hyper-modern technology that we don't have in this country. But it's already very stretched. And so I suppose these appeals by somebody like John Healey in this country as the defense secretary, the idea that the Russian tanks are going to roll into Poland and Germany just seems quite unlikely when we've had this for 4 years. But you're saying that's completely wrong. It's perfectly plausible.
I can agree that the tanks rolling anywhere is unlikely. The tanks became obsolete during this war. So it's a drone war. Tanks, unless there is a way to protect the tanks from the drones, tanks are not anymore on the front lines. So tanks are not rolling, but a lot of things changed since the Cold War. But one thing is still the same. There are still two nuclear superpowers in the world. And one of those superpowers in Russia is Russia. And Russia uses nuclear blackmail in Ukraine, but also in other places to get what they want. The nuclear blackmail led to the fact that support for Ukraine from Biden administration, from others, was actually limited and delayed. So you can get a lot of things even without sending the tanks that are not actually, that can't really move anymore because of the drones, but you can get a lot and make people to do a lot by threatening them. And Russia still has a lot of stuff to threaten, and this is first and foremost things nuclear. So we in the West, we really learned or unlearned things that we knew during the Cold War, that you can't blink. The nuclear weapons, first and foremost, about psychological impact. They were used only once, but then were the major factor in the entire Cold War, and that's about their ability to threaten and to make people do certain things that people would not do otherwise. And that arsenal in Russia has. It's much bigger than whatever Europe has. That's why America is so important in all that entire story.
I want to talk about nuclear weapons in 1 second, but just to be clear, so you're not potentially projecting the possibility of tanks rolling into Poland and Germany, but you wouldn't rule out very large drone strikes in 10, 20 years, or maybe even sooner, on a major German city, for instance.
I don't have to imagine anything. This is already happening. I don't have to imagine cyber attacks, which
Not
is which,
cyber.
which is an act of war.
Sure, but I mean, the possibility of a conventional airstrike on somewhere like Germany, for instance, you think is quite plausible.
Well, uh, I don't know when was the last time that you were flying in Germany. I was trying to do that recently. The airspace, Germany airspace was closed. The airspace over Munich was closed recently. It's already after I was flying there. So it's already happening. All of these questions that you ask about the future, they're with us now. It's already happening. These are acts of war. There is no response. There is blinking, 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 blinking. So that's where we are. This is just the facts.
So nukes. After the collapse of the USSR, Ukraine has the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world as a function of being a very large nation within what was previously the USSR. Should Ukraine never have given up those nuclear weapons?
Looking from where Ukraine is now in this horrible war, that's the answer that I hear in Ukraine is, okay, that was a major blunder. Who is responsible for that? Who are those people? We'll hang them right here. As a historian, I can say I don't think that Ukraine had much of a choice, given that it was pressured by not only Russia, that remained at that time to be a regional power with a lot of influence over Ukraine, but also was pressured by the United States, by global superpower. And the young state that was born nuclear with really very bad economy, 1990s in the former Soviet space, that was they make the Great Depression and then Great Recession to look like just a picnic and a wonderful time. So it wasn't in a position to say no. And President Clinton, who played an important role in Budapest Memorandum 94 that really finalized the entire thing of Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons in exchange for assurances of territorial integrity. So President Clinton, who was part of that already twice at least, from what I know, from what I saw, publicly stated that he regrets his role in disarmament of Ukraine. So it's a big really underlining factor and factor that eventually made this largest war in Europe possible. But again, and as I say, there is a lot of anger today in Ukraine. But as a historian, I don't see how Ukraine could hold to nuclear weapons back in 93, 94.
Were there not people in Ukraine, in the sort of Ukrainian political space at the time, saying, look, you always get contrarians in politics, and sometimes they're right. That's why it's useful to have a pluralistic society, because they can, steel man your arguments. Were there not people saying, look, we can talk about the economy and standards of living, and that's all really important, but it's meaningless without sovereignty, and we don't have sovereignty contra Russia unless we have nuclear weapons? Was nobody saying that?
Some people were saying that, but that was really minority. The majority of Ukrainians, I would say, until 2014, couldn't just imagine war with Russia. While Ukrainians and Russians are not one and the same people, as Putin has claimed, there is a lot of historical experience living together. There is big chunks of Ukraine are Russian speaking, and so on and so forth. So that what happened in 2014 and especially in 2022 was a shocker to the Ukrainian society and to a degree to the political elite, that first of all the war can be waged, and then that the war can be waged with that sort of ways and methods. So Ukrainian society of 93, the main challenge was actually how to survive in that extremely difficult economic conditions. There was also general atmosphere, not just in Ukraine, but worldwide, that a sort of history came to an end, not in terms of victory of liberal democracy, but the the end of big wars and big confrontations. Ukraine won its independence by referendum, right? So the war for independence, now we know, was postponed. So that also influenced people. So basically, it matters what we think. It matters how we vote. The wars are in the past. And by the way, we have to put something on the table today. So again, after living through this war, I think the whoever comes later in Ukraine, the people, voters, political leaders, they would be thinking about first and foremost about the way how to protect whatever political system they got, whatever economy they got, whatever culture they got. But that was not thinking in '93. And one more thing that was unique for Ukraine and probably different from other countries is that Ukrainian mobilization that eventually led toward the movement toward independence was born out of Chernobyl disaster and public mobilization against the authorities, against the regime, saying that, okay, you, first of all, allowed that to happen, and then you are hiding information from us. Tell us the truth about Chernobyl. So that was the first public manifestations in Ukraine. They were linked to Chernobyl. So the whole idea that nuclear, it's an awful thing, and the good thing is to get rid of nuclear and live in the nuclear-free world, that also came from a Ukrainian experience around Chernobyl. So that was experience, and the war for independence at that time wasn't experience. So we all very much depend on what we saw first with our own eyes, tried. In reality, there are books out there, but unless really that somehow influenced us, impacted us, we really don't really put that at the center of our decision making. So it's I think it's true about us humans, but it's true about societies as well.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting because you're right. You know, we're in 2025, and so everybody's talking about realpolitik. But you have to go back to the early 1990s, this supremely ideological moment. Civil society seems to work. You don't need violence. You don't need wars.
Exactly.
You don't even need nuclear power. It's bad. And it feels like a foreign world now. Well, it was a foreign world. It's in the past. It wasn't just Ukraine that gave up nuclear weapons, of course, in the 1990s.
Ukraine was one of three other republics of the Soviet Union that had nuclear arsenals. Beside Russia, there was Ukraine, there was Belarus and Kazakhstan. Ukraine had the largest arsenal after Russia, so the third largest after the United States of America. And Ukraine, unlike Belarus or Kazakhstan, it actually it fought not to give up nuclear weapons, but they convinced the Americans to recognize that was that was the Ukrainian property, that the nukes that were going to Russia had to be disarmed and the uranium to be used for nuclear power plants or something like that, and that there would be a financial compensation. So they got something, and then they insisted on the Budapest Memorandum, where the promises were given that in exchange for giving up the third nuclear arsenal, Ukraine gets, in Ukrainian and Russian version of the agreement, it says guarantees. In American, British, French, it says assurances of territorial integrity and sovereignty. And it also expanded to Kazakhstan and to Belarus. But it was because Ukraine actually was making was resistant to a degree. But the resistance was not about giving up nuclear weapons, but resistance was about actually getting compensating and recognizing Ukraine as the owner and getting guarantees of security. Because when US forced Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons and send them to Russia, Russia was making claims already on Ukrainian territory and Crimea in particular. So the issue of security was of concern. But the way how the Ukrainian political elite, hoped to solve them was through the Budapest Memorandum. They wanted much more robust guarantees, but Budapest Memorandum was all what they got at that time.
Was that a mistranslation? Because obviously that's a huge difference between guarantees, a guarantee is why Britain gets involved in the Second World War, and assurances. Is that just the translator had an off day, or?
No, that was that sort of ambiguity that the Americans and British signed on assurances, and
But that was intentional, or?
no, it was intentional, of course. Every comma, every word, every term in that sense means something. And
So they pulled a fast one over Ukraine, basically.
sorry?
They pulled a fast one over Ukraine.
Yes, but Russia had guarantees and then violated them. So again, there are also limits of how much words mean.
Sure.
But in this particular case, they had huge meaning.
And does that anger Ukrainians today? They say, look, there's an international treaty which was meant to avoid all of this.
That angers, and President Zelensky was talking about that, including before the all-out invasion in February of 2022. So yeah, it's being brought up again and again. But I would say that there is more anger in Ukraine today toward the leaders of Ukraine at that time, back in the 90s, rather than the West. Of course, there is a lot of a lot of unhappiness about the Western position. There is no question about that. But real anger, it's about your own leaders.
Beyond the former Soviet states, I mean, I didn't realize before I read your newest book, The Nuclear Age, which is so good.
Thank you.
I was saying before we started, you're talking about nuclear annihilation, but it's actually a very good read. It's very fun to read. I never realized that the Swedes had quite an advanced nuclear program. And talking about countries that gave up, they had nuclear weapons. I didn't realize that South Africa had the bomb,
Yeah, more than one.
Yeah.
More than one.
How many did they have?
I would say at least 10, maybe something like that in that range. Yeah. And they gave up around the same time when the Budapest Memorandum and disarmament of the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan took place. But they did that mostly out of their own volition. So the Cold War came to an end. The white supremacist regime that built the bomb because they were concerned that the Soviet-supported troops and armies from Angola and whatever countries and north of south of Namibia and which was de facto colony of South Africa, and then north of South Africa that they could attack. So they were trying to use it as a deterrence. And then the white regime was leaving the turning keys from the government offices to the black majority. And they also wanted to join the international community because through most of apartheid, they were quite isolated. The sanctions on apartheid were not as robust as many people wanted, but still it wasn't a particularly happy life. So they wanted to join the international community. And to join the international community in the 1990s meant that you sign the non-proliferation agreement as a non-nuclear country. So turning the keys to the black majority, trying to rejoin the international community, those were the motivations to give up nuclear weapons, and realization that, again, nuclear weapons are already obsolete. It's not the way how Ukrainians thought, but very close to that. Okay, we are in the new era. That the threats that were there don't exist anymore, and there were very particular threats how they were imagined by white supremacist leadership. So it's really one of very few cases where the country decided that it was in that country's interest to give up nukes.
Which country had the most impressive nuclear program? Because, there's a great detail in there about South Africa's. It was 1% of their defense budget.
Yes, probably. I would have to check
And it's a
my
country
own book. Yes.
subject to massive sanctions. I mean, that's really.
Yeah.
But then you've got the Russian program, or the Soviet program rather, which was hugely impressive. You've got the British program, which is also really impressive in its own way. So which one to you do you think, in historical context, actually that was a real feat of statescraft and political management?
Well, I would single out two of them, and they're very different cases. One is the US, the Americans who got the bomb. First of all, to really imagine the whole thing that somewhere out there are atoms that you can't see, and then out of that can come energy that can destroy a city. For politicians was quite a risk. And then the scientists were asking to spend enormous amounts, millions and millions of dollars in the US. And in the middle of the war, when that millions were needed on the front line. So President Roosevelt decided to take that risk and spent money, a lot of money, without Congress knowing that money, where the money was going. And then this enormous effort on the part of scientists who were also terrified of the Nazi bomb. Many of them refugees from Europe, from Nazi regime, that they turned that idea into a bomb in a very short period of time because they were so concerned about Hitler getting the bomb first. So I guess that remains to be the story. And Oppenheimer is there, and the film is so popular, and the book is popular for the reason. But then on the other hand, there is basically the story of North Korea, which is it's still I can't understand. The atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, in complete isolation at the expense of big chunks of the population dying. Before that, there was a Pakistani bomb, and the leader of Pakistan said that we would be eating grass and leaves if it takes, but we'll get the bomb. That's a very different story. But if you would, when I think about the most striking stories of nuclear development and proliferation, I would look at the American one, and then at North Korean, which is really horrifying.
I have to say the British one was also really impressive, because I think the spend, you say in the book, is about half that of the Manhattan Project, which to be expected. A lot of the science has been confirmed, etc. There's some sharing of blueprints and intelligence and whatnot. But the fact that Britain does it when it's got very little money, and even Churchill doesn't know this thing's being developed. I mean, to do that in secrecy, something so big, is a really, it's an extraordinary feat. And it does make you think that was carried out by a ministry called the Ministry of Supply.
Right.
And of course, we live in a world now of outsourcing giants and PFI and private contracts. Right. I suspect they wouldn't have done quite as good a job as the Ministry of Supply. So as somebody on the left, it's a good argument for, the state having a bigger role in production. How many countries do you think in the next 15, 20 years, if we look at the 1990s as that moment where, for ideological, geopolitical reasons, people thought war's over, conflict's over. That's the 90s vibe. We're now in a very different moment, right? Whether that's Israel, Gaza, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, it seems like there's just a return of the history of the big H in many aspects. The possibility of a technological leader not being an Atlantic power, but a Pacific one with China. So many things are in flux. And I suppose to apply that to this conversation, well, loads of people denuclearized in the 1990s. How many states could nuclearize over the next 20, 25 years, given that history is back?
Yeah. Well, first of all, about the UK experience, it's really interesting in the ways that you just talked about that. It was the Labour government, the left government, that built the bomb. And Ernst Bevin was the secretary, the foreign secretary, and he said that, well, let's put the Union Jack on that thing because I don't want my successors to have the sort of conversation that I just had with my American counterpart. So it wasn't. It was certainly anti-Soviet bomb, but to a degree, it was also anti-American in a sense, just trying to protect the British autonomy in the international relations, if not great power status as well. So it is an interesting case. In terms of the how many countries there can be armed with nuclear, in the early 1960s, the US President John Kennedy, he was talking about 20 countries before the end of the 1960s, before the end of the decade, and we still have only 9. So 3 of them went nuclear after the end of the Cold War. It's India, Pakistan, and North Korea. The estimates are of people that are smarter than me in a sense, understand really the technology and capabilities, that up to 40 countries today can go nuclear within a couple of years. Because the nuclear is an old mid-20th century technology. You probably still can't build it in your garage. But it's if North Koreans manage to do that, almost anyone can do that in terms of access to technology, but also in terms of the financial resources. So we are now in a very dangerous place in terms of potential new proliferation, because we talked about Ukraine. Anyone who looks at Ukraine today and links together, you give up nuclear weapons and you are being you're being destroyed. So probably it's not a good idea to give up nuclear weapons, and maybe it's a good idea to think about nuclear weapons as a deterrence. And then United States is not sure anymore whether it's actually wants to perform the role that it performed in the world since 1945. That's a big question for Europe. Now in Europe, there are discussions about Article 5 of NATO, whether actually it means anything or not. People checking the language, whether it's guarantees or assurances, and then Google what guarantees mean and what assurances mean. So big uncertainty. And the power that arms itself in nuclear terms in the most actively is China. China is a nuclear mid-size power and is an economic superpower. So there is this balance there that they're trying to fill that gap by developing as fast as they can the nuclear arsenal. And people in countries like not just Taiwan, but also in Japan, in South Korea that doesn't have nukes when North Korea has nukes, are becoming more and more nervous, and nervous also about the United States if it comes to a major and serious crisis, whether the United States will show up or not. So that's that moment of uncertainty, and also a major blow to the non-proliferation regime by events in Ukraine put us in the situation where we can, within the next 10 years, we can probably see, I don't think 40, but 2, 3, 4, 5 new nuclear kids on the block. Who, some of them may be nervous, others not knowing and not having experience dealing with things nuclear. So it's always a problem.
So a world of multipolarity, and you're not predicting multipolarity. You talk about, in all likelihood, you think we're moving to a world of bipolarity, which makes these kinds of things easier to manage. But a world of multipolarity probably means a world of proliferation.
Yes. I didn't think about that in those terms, but I think you're absolutely right. That the multipolar world means proliferation. The question is that you still can't have 100 poles in the world, right? So, and the question is whether as the poles of that multipolar world would serve the countries that already have nuclear weapons, or there would emerge new ones that would try to get nuclear weapons. If there will be a new country that would try to play that claim that great power status, there would be certainly proliferation for sure. If it would be, let's say, still the guys who are members of the nuclear club, let's say India, then no proliferation. If Brazil moves in that position, yes, there will be proliferation.
I spoke to a gentleman recently, Vali Nasser, who's an Iranian-American academic. He's at Johns Hopkins. And he's written this fantastic book about Iranian geostrategy and these ideas of forward defense, sacred defense domestically, and sacred resilience economy. But forward defense is the really interesting bit. So why are they adopting all these strategies of asymmetric warfare with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, with regards to extraterritorial forces, the Al-Quds Force? Why are they funding all these proxies in all these places? And his interpretation of it is actually it's born out of a sort of a military doctrine of self-defense. And if Iran's defense isn't in Syria, isn't in Gaza, isn't in all these places, then it'll be on the Iranian border. And that's born out of historic experience because of the Russians and the Brits and the Americans, the Iran-Iraq War. Super interesting. And basically, he says that forward defense was a nuclear weapons program on the cheap, right? You're trying to guarantee your sovereignty on the cheap. And his view is probably they'll get rid of it because it's failed. It's no longer functional. And they'll probably have to inevitably try some kind of either open up to the world, quite unlikely, who knows, or post Khamenei, they go after nuclear weapons, which I found a really, really interesting thought. And this idea, having spoken to him and now talking to you, basically in the 21st century, the hallmark of not even a great power, but a middle power would be nuclear aspirations. I mean, that sounds quite terrifying. You know, Saudi Arabia, Iran.
But that's what it is. We talked about UK, and I quoted Ernst Bevin, right, a union organizer who went into politics and became a senior member of the UK government. Yeah, for him it was about sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States, the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union potential, but the sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States. So there is no reason to imagine that these ideas about sovereignty somehow limited just to the British Islands and don't apply in Iran. So I basically agree with that argument.
Before we finish, can I ask you for some forecasts?
Sure. Absolutely.
I know they're almost always a fool's errand, but you're a very astute, intelligent man. You read lots, you're on top of lots of things, so why not? How likely do you think a nuclear conflict is in the next couple of decades? By which I mean, a relatively small weapon like we see in Hiroshima, not a hydrogen bomb. How probable is that, do you think?
I'm certainly hopeful that it is not happening. And I will explain what my hope is based on. We had a moment in fall of 2022 when Russians either were considering to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine because things were not going well, that the Russian front line were crumbling, they were withdrawing from all sorts of places. Either they were considering to use nuclear weapons or they basically wanted to blackmail and they leaked information that they were doing that. What really happened, for my understanding and for my argument, really doesn't matter. What happened later matters because it looks like there was a quite strong response, not only from the United States, please don't do that, but also from China. And we talked about China. China is very conservative in many ways, and it's certainly not prepared to play the game, nuclear game today, when it is not a superpower. And China has influence over many places, not only the United States, the UK, the other old members of the club, they're not interested in going nuclear, but also China, the rising power, at least for the next 10, 15 years, and as a minimum until they're on par. They're not interested in that as well. So with that constellation, I am really hopeful that the taboo on the use of nuclear weapons that really came into effect after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it would last for another 10, 15 years, then we'll see what the new constellation looks like.
It's kind of a miracle that we didn't see more of them in the 20th century, right?
More of use of the nuclear weapons? Yeah. Yes, it is. It is. And it's the biggest miracle for me is even the power of people's imagination, because not use of nuclear weapons was imagined in 1913 by H.G. Wells, who first imagined the nuclear war and then thought that the use of nuclear would really, he believed, would create, or hoped that it would create a global government, because the war would become inconceivable. And then people around Oppenheimer, who built the bomb, they argued a very morally problematic thing. They actually were saying that long term, we should to use the bomb on the humans. Because if we don't do that, the world will not know what a terrible thing that would be, and it would, one way or another, sleepwalk into the nuclear war. Horrible thing to say. Hundreds of thousands of people killed in Japan. But the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is still with us, and I hope it will continue. So it's a big theme in my book. It's fear, and how fear really makes nations to build a bomb or to give up bomb or respond in kind. So we are still, thank God, as human race, we are still very fearful of what we witnessed, or our fathers, grandfathers, whatever it was, witnessed in Japan back in the fall of 1945.
So many people are down on human nature. They're black-pilled, and we're stupid, and things are getting worse, and that's all. I mean, a lot of it's true, but the fact that these things weren't used since 1945 is just, it does restore some hope in humanity. My next question then, or my last question, with regards to forecasts, how's the Russia-Ukraine conflict going to end, do you think? Because in 2023 and the afterwards of this, you're not optimistic, but you can see green shoots of how things are going to conclude. Has that thinking changed?
Basically not. Some details certainly changed, but I will base my kind of a prediction about that on what we discussed at the very beginning of our conversation. I view this war as the war of disintegration of empires. And the optimism for Ukraine comes from the way how long-term most of those wars end. Empires disappear. Empire crumble, they reinvent themselves as nation states, and the countries that come out of empires, if not always thrive, but certainly continue and outlive empires. So the chances for Ukraine to follow this pattern are quite high. The problem with that sort of analysis and that sort of framing is that the disintegration of empire, this is not an event, this is a process, and the process that can go not just for decades, but for centuries. And I hope that this war that we have, once it comes to an end, that will be the final chapter, certainly in relations between Ukraine and empire. I have no problem seeing that this war ends with Ukraine's victory, which means maintaining sovereignty. But I have serious problem predicting when it might happen.
And do you think it recovers the territories it's lost, or it recovers some of them and not others?
I don't know. I hope if that happens, this is good for Ukraine, this is good for international order. But I also know that in Eastern Europe, every country that was born out of the fall of empire, after World War I, from Poland to Czechoslovakia to others, to fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans, all of them actually underwent through change, borders were shifting. So historically, again, the pattern is going against Ukraine in that sense. So we'll see how it will happen.
Super interesting. Sergei, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome.